They say the ocean is a vast, empty space. They lie. Welcome to Blackwater Island, a place where the waves don't just break. They remember. My name is Marcus Thorne, a marine biologist seeking solitude, a penance for a loss I couldn't bear. Instead, I found myself on an island that demanded 3 strange rules just to stay alive. What's the loneliest place you've ever been? Tell me in the comments below. And if you're brave enough to face the tide, subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules and ring that bell. Because out here, the sea doesn't just take. It gives back. And what it gives back is never truly dead. The watch begins now. The salt spray that lashed my face wasn't cleansing. It felt like an accusation. Each wave that slammed against the aging hull of Harold Pierce's fishing trawler, the sea serpent, echoed the rhythmic crash of my own personal shipwreck. 3 years. 3 years since Lena's laughter had last danced on the wind. Since her hand had slipped from mine in the icy, chaotic waters of the Gorda Ridge. They never found her. They never found any of them. And the guilt, a cold, constant companion, had finally driven me here, to Blackwater Island, a jagged shard of rock and stunted pine, thrusting defiantly from the churning gray apathy of the North Atlantic. My estranged uncle, a man I'd met twice in my 38 years, had left me this crumbling lighthouse, this patch-Scylla godforsaken solitude. Perhaps he knew it was the only fitting mausoleum for a man like me, a marine biologist, Dr. Marcus Thorne, whose last expedition had swallowed his team, his love, and his soul whole. Harold Pierce, a man carved from salt and silence, cut the engine. The sudden quiet was deafening, broken only by the mournful cries of unseen gulls and the incessant hungry roar of the surf against the island's rocky teeth. He gestured with a calloused thumb towards a dilapidated stone jetty. "This is it, Doc. Blackwater Point. Welcome home, I suppose." There was no warmth in his voice, just the flat neutrality Scylla man, long accustomed to the vagaries of the sea and the follies of men. The lighthouse itself was a crumbling sentinel, its lantern fractured, its whitewash peeling like sunburned skin. Beside it squatted a small, weather-beaten cottage. As I hauled my meager belongings onto the jetty, a figure emerged from the cottage, as weathered and ancient as the island itself. Old Finn Finnegan, they called him. The island's only other permanent resident, a man with eyes like chips of sea glass, and a beard that looked as if it had snared a century's worth of storms. He didn't offer a greeting, just fixed me with a disconcerting stare. "So, another Thorne comes to feed the tide," he rasped, his voice like sand and gravel. He pointed a gnarled finger towards the turbulent water. "This island, she has rules, son. 3 of them. You'd do well to learn them. Learn them by heart." And there, on that desolate shore, with the wind whipping my hair and the taste of brine on my lips, old Finn laid them out. Each rule the pronouncement Scylla doom. Never touch the bodies that wash ashore after storms, especially if they look familiar. Push the moving dead back to sea with long poles. No direct contact. And if a washed-up body calls your name in a voice you recognize, run inland, for what knows your name was never human and learns by mimicking loss. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as the ramblings of a senile hermit, but the utter, unwavering conviction in his faded eyes froze the laughter in my throat. My first nights on Blackwater were a descent into a solitude so profound it felt like a living entity. The constant thrum of the waves, the sighing wind, the unfamiliar creaks and groans Scylla cottage. Every sound was amplified, taking on a sinister edge in the crushing darkness. Lena haunted my dreams, not as she was, vibrant and alive, but as a waterlogged, silent accuser, her eyes wide and empty. And sometimes I'd wake with a jolt, convinced I'd heard a faint, melodic humming from the direction of the deep ocean, a sound that vibrated not in my ears, but in my bones. Then the storm hit. It wasn't just a storm, it was a cataclysm, a frenzied, week-long assault by the Atlantic. I weathered it in the precarious shelter of the Lighthouse tower, the wind shrieking like a banshee, the tower itself groaning and swaying as if it might be torn from its very foundations. When it finally blew itself out, leaving behind a bruised, exhausted Dawn, I descended weary and raw-nerved. And there, on the scoured clean crescent of beach below the lighthouse, lay a dark, elongated shape, stark against the pale sand. The scent hit me even from the tower steps, a thick, cloying miasma of salt, decay, and something else, something deeply, primordially wrong. My stomach lurched. The tide had brought its first offering. Even from a distance, the thing on the beach was an abomination. The first rule screamed unheard in the rational scientific corner of my mind, but the morbid curiosity, the ingrained habit of a biologist facing the unknown, was a powerful countercurrent. I approached cautiously, my boots sinking into the damp, storm-tossed sand. It was vaguely human, bloated, discolored, festooned with grotesque strands of seaweed that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. The features were mostly obliterated, smoothed and sculpted into a horrifying anonymity by the relentless chafe of the sea and its scavengers. But the general size, the length of what might have been limbs, it was a disturbing match for an adult. The stench was overwhelming now, a sickening cocktail of brine, putrefaction, and that same underlying, deeply unsettling aquatic wrongness. A shadow fell over me. Old Finn, he stood there, a long, weathered boathook in his gnarled hands, his sea-glass eyes fixed not on me, but on the grotesque offering. He didn't speak, just began to work, his movements economical and practiced. He hooked the thing by a tattered piece of what might have been clothing, and with grunts of effort, began to push and lever it back towards the hungry surf. Sea takes what it's owed, he muttered. More to the corpse than to me. And we return what ain't ours to keep. As a larger wave finally claimed the bloated mass, dragging it back into the churning gray, Finn turned his unnervingly placid gaze on me. You touch 'em, son. You invite 'em in. They ain't who they seem. They're just masks the water wears. His words, stark and unadorned, sent a fresh shiver down my spine. I retreated to the lighthouse, seeking solace in my uncle's forgotten possessions. His logs, initially filled with mundane observations of weather and tides, grew more erratic in the later years. Talk of the deep songs, of faces in the waves, of a pact made in salt and blood. He wrote of objects washing ashore, strangely preserved, sometimes bearing an uncanny resemblance to items lost by islanders generations before. The tide remembers, one entry read, and it is patient. My satellite phone, my only tenuous link to the outside world, crackled to life a few days later. Deputy Eva Rostova, from the Mainland Sheriff's Department in Port Clyde. Her voice was young, crisp, professional, but with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. Concern, or perhaps a deeply ingrained local suspicion. Just checking in, Dr. Thorne, she said. Blackwater Island. It's got a bit of a reputation. Not many folks last long out there. You need anything, you give us a call. But some things out there, best left to the sea. Another warning veiled in official courtesy. The next storm was less violent, a brooding northeaster that churned the waters for a day and a night. The following morning, the tide had delivered again. Another shape on the beach. This one was smaller, less ravaged by the immediate journey. As I approached, my heart stuttering in my chest, my vision tunneled. The clothes were tattered, yes, but the style, the faded blue of the jacket, and then I saw it, glinting dully in the weak morning light, tangled in a mass of what had once been dark, curling hair. A small silver locket shaped like a sand dollar. The locket I had given Lena on our first anniversary. My breath caught in my throat, a ragged, painful gasp. It couldn't be. It couldn't. But the silent, screaming evidence lay there on the wet sand, a grotesque parody of my deepest, most sacred loss. The first rule was no longer an old man's rambling. It was a personal, visceral torment. The world tilted. Bile rose in my throat. Lena. Not Lena. It can't be. My mind screamed denial, even as my eyes drank in the horrifyingly familiar details of the thing on the beach. The silver locket winked at me, a cruel mockery. The faded blue jacket, her favorite, now plastered with sand and something dark and viscid. I stumbled back, the first rule of a roaring inferno in my brain. Never touch them, especially if they look familiar. This was more than familiar. This was a piece of my soul, spat back onto the shore by an indifferent, or perhaps malevolent ocean. My hands trembled, balled into fists. I wanted to run to it, to gather it up, to scream at the injustice. Scylla universe. Then a flicker Scylla movement. A slight, almost imperceptible twitch of a waterlogged finger. The bloated chest cavity seemed to expand, just a fraction. A wet, sighing sound like air escaping a punctured lung reached my ears. When the dead appear to be breathing or moving slightly, don't approach. Instead, push them back to sea with long poles, without touching them directly. Old Finn's gravelly voice, his second rule. My scientific mind reeled. Hypoxia, post-mortem muscle spasms, gas buildup, or something else. Something that fit the island's chilling. I found a long piece of driftwood, bleached and smooth by the sea. An inadequate substitute for Finn's bowhook. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a sickening thud. Approaching the thing that wore Lena's face, Lena's locket, felt like wading into my own personal hell. The stench was appalling, the intimate scent of her shampoo now a ghastly undercurrent to the reek of oceanic decay. With shaking hands, I extended the driftwood, pressing it against the sodden jacket. The body yielded with a horrible soft plasticity, pushing her. It, back towards the incoming tide, felt like the ultimate act of betrayal, a desecration of memory itself. Each shove was a fresh torment. Finally, a wave, larger than the others, slunk up the beach and dragged its grisly offering back into the gray, churning maw. I collapsed onto the sand, gasping. The image of that slight movement, that faint sigh, burned into my retinas. Harold Pierce arrived later that day, his sea serpent chugging into the small cove, laden with my requested supplies. He found me sitting woodenly on the lighthouse steps, staring out at the unforgiving ocean. His weathered face was, as usual, impassive, but his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, lingered on me for a moment longer than necessary. I told him about the bodies, about the thing that looked like Lena. He listened without interruption, then merely nodded. "Sea's a fickle mistress, Doc," he said, his voice flat. "Gives and takes. Best not to question her moods or what she spews back. Sometimes she just wants to remind us who's boss." His words, meant perhaps as rough comfort, felt hollow, almost rehearsed. There was a deep, unnerving stillness about Harold Pierce, a sense of ancient secrets kept locked behind a fisherman's stoic facade. My satellite phone crackled that evening. Deputy Rostova. Her voice was tight with a carefully controlled concern. "Dr. Thorne, I've been reviewing some unusual maritime reports. Old ones. Anomalous disappearances, strange sightings around Blackwater over the decades. My superiors, they tend to dismiss them. But my grandmother, she grew up in Port Clyde, used to tell stories. Stories about your island." She paused. "I think I need to come out there, Dr. Thorne? Officially. Just a welfare check. Unofficially. I've got a bad feeling. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the lighthouse, every sigh of the wind, seemed to carry the cadence of Lena's name, her voice. I huddled by the small, sputtering fire in the cottage. A bottle of whiskey, my only companion. Just as exhaustion was finally threatening to claim me, I heard it, clear as a winter bell, drifting through the thin walls of the cottage from the direction of the beach, where the waves crashed relentlessly. Marcus, my blood turned to ice. It was weak, slightly distorted by distance and the roar of the surf, but it was undeniably, unmistakably Lena's voice. The voice I knew better than my own. Marcus, I am so cold. Please, help me. My heart leaped into my throat, a wild, terrified bird. The third rule. Run inland immediately. It hammered against my skull, a frantic counterpoint to the siren song Scylla voice. But this wasn't just any voice. This was Lena, my Lena. The rational part of my brain, what little remained, screamed that it was impossible. A hallucination born of grief, isolation, and too much whiskey. But the yearning, the desperate, aching hope that it might somehow be true, was a powerful undertow, threatening to drag me out into the storm-tossed night. Marcus? Why did you leave me out here? It's so dark. The voice was closer now, pleading, imbued with a heartbreaking vulnerability that was pure Lena. I stumbled to the cottage door, my hand on the rusted latch. Outside, the wind howled, whipping rain against the salt-caked windows. The lighthouse beam, a feeble, intermittent sweep, offered little comfort. To run inland into the island's small, tangled heart of stunted pines and grasping thorns, in this weather in the pitch black, it was madness. But to stay, to listen to that voice tear me apart piece by piece. A sudden, vivid image of old Finn's face, his sea glass eyes burning with a grim certainty, flashed through my mind. What knows your name was never human, and it's learning to mimic those you've lost. Learning. That word, more than any other, propelled me. With a choked sob, I wrenched the door open and plunged out, not towards the beach, but towards the barely discernible track leading into the island's interior. Marcus, don't go. I need you. The voice followed, sharper now, laced with an unnerving thread of something else. Resentment, hunger. It pursued me as I crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at my clothes, rain stinging my eyes. It whispered memories only Lena and I shared. Our first date, the hidden cove where we'd. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the voice seemed to bypass them, echoing directly inside my skull, a cruel, intimate violation, still a sacred moments. I don't know how long I ran, or in what direction. Eventually, I collapsed at the foot of an ancient, wind-twisted pine, gasping for breath, soaked to the bone, the voice finally receding into the storm's fury, leaving behind a ringing, horrified silence. Deputy Eva Rostova found me there the next morning, after navigating the treacherous crossing in a sturdy sheriff's department launch. I was a wreck, huddled against the tree, rambling, half delirious from exposure and terror. She listened patiently, her expression carefully neutral, as I recounted the voice, the rules, the bodies. I expected dismissal, perhaps even a quiet call for a psychiatric evaluation. Instead, she produced a thermos Scylla hot coffee and a thick blanket. My grandmother used to say Blackwater wasn't an island, Dr. Thorne, Eva said softly, after I'd regained some semblance of composure. She called it the pantry, said the old ones who lived in the deep used it to stock up. Together, fueled by a strange mixture of my terror-induced conviction and her inherited unease, we began to explore old Finn, when we found him sheltering in a sea cave usually well above the high tide mark, was more lucid, or perhaps more desperate, than I'd ever seen him. He showed us carvings, almost obliterated by time and leaking, on the cave walls, crude depictions of a many-tentacled colossal form rising from the waves, prostrate human figures offering something. The Tidekeepers, Finn rasped, pointing a trembling finger. They made a pact. Blood for bounty, silence for safety, but the Whisperer, it always wants more. Following a clue from one of my uncle's more cryptic journal entries, we found another cave. This one hidden behind a curtain of sea-blasted ivy, higher up the cliffs. Inside, the air was frigid, stagnant. By the light of our flashlights, we found them. Piles of Scylla human bones. Some ancient, some disturbingly recent. Crude ritual implements. And more carvings, these clearly chronicling the activities Scylla supposedly cult the Tidekeepers. They detailed the gifts from the sea, bodies, and the methods of returning them, along with chilling references to the entities' ability to wear the faces and voices Scylla lost. To learn the shape, Scylla, sorrow. Then Eva's flashlight beam settled on something tucked into a crevice. A leather-bound ledger, its pages brittle. It was a record, meticulously kept. Scylla offerings and harvests. And beside some entries, notes about ocean currents. My blood ran colder still as I recognized the handwriting. Harold Pierce, detailed charts showed anomalous currents. Currents that, with a sickening lurch of recognition, I realized led almost directly from the Gorda Ridge, the site of my lost expedition, straight to the shores of Blackwater Island. This wasn't just an inheritance. This was a carefully orchestrated lure, and I was the catch. The air in the hidden sea cave grew thick and heavy, pregnant with the unspoken atrocities of generations. Harold Pierce's ledger, his meticulous account of death and appeasement, lay open between us, a monument to a chilling, enduring pact. The carefully plotted ocean currents leading from the Gorda Ridge, from the watery grave of Lena and my team, to this godforsaken island, were not a coincidence. They were a carefully laid snare. My inheritance hadn't been a gift of solitude. It had been a summons. He knew, I whispered, the words raw in my throat. Pierce. He knew who I was, what I'd lost, even before I set foot on his damned boat. The image of his impassive face, his non-committal pronouncements about the sea, now took on a sinister, predatory cast. Eva Rostova was pale, but her expression was grimly determined. The Tidekeepers. My grandmother spoke of them like a myth, a boogeyman to scare children away from the dangerous coves. But this, she gestured at the bones, the crude altars. This is real, and Pierce is at the heart of it. She tapped a recurring symbol in the ledger, a stylized wave cradling a single staring eye. This was carved into the support beams of the old fish cannery in Port Clyde, the one his family owned for generations. They're more than just islanders, Marcus. They're a legacy. Our fragile radio link to the mainland had been intermittent since the last big storm. Now, as if sensing our discovery, it crackled decisively to life. It wasn't the sheriff's department. It was Harold Pierce. His voice, usually flat and emotionless, held a new, almost unctuous quality. Doc Thorne? Deputy? Having a bit of an explore, are we? Best be careful. Some old places. They don't like being disturbed. There was no overt threat, but the implication hung heavy, cold as the cave air. He knew where we were. How? We know about the Tidekeepers, Pierce. Eva snapped into the handset, her voice tight with fury. We know about the sacrifices. A low chuckle, dry as driftwood, came back. Sacrifices. Deputy. You mainlanders have such a dramatic turn of phrase. We prefer to call it an understanding. An ancient covenant. The sea provides. The sea protects. In return, it asks for very little. Just a bit of company now and then. Those who are already lost to it mostly. A kindness, really. Saves them the long drift. Lena, I choked out. My wife, the bodies. You brought them here. You used her. Ah, yes, the lovely Lena. Pierce's voice was smooth, almost sympathetic, and that made it 1,000 times more monstrous. The Whisperer, it has a fondness for fresh sorrows. They make the imprints so much clearer, helps it learn, helps it understand. You, Doctor, with all your deep-sea knowledge, all your poignant losses, you are a veritable feast of understanding. Then, the nature of the connection became chillingly clear as Pierce spoke. The very air in the cave seemed to resonate with his words. I could almost feel him, not just as a voice on the radio, but as a presence, a pressure. And then, from the dark, dripping mouth of the cave leading back out to the storm-lashed cliffs, a figure emerged. Harold Pierce, but not as we knew him. He still wore his fisherman's oilskins, but they seemed to cling to him differently, almost organically. His eyes, usually the flat gray of a winter sea, now held pinpricks of an unnatural, luminous blue, like bioluminescence from the abyssal depths. And when he spoke, his voice was doubled, layered, his own familiar rasp, and beneath it, a sibilant, echoing whisper that was not human. The radio in Eva's hand went dead with a crackle of static. The Covenant isn't just about offerings, Doctor, Pierce and the Whisperer said, the voices intertwining, a horrifying duet. It's a hosts, anchors, for a consciousness too vast for your flimsy world to comprehend without a translator. They gestured with a hand that seemed subtly webbed, elongated. Decades ago, the sea was angry. My ship, my crew, torn apart. I offered myself, my lineage in exchange for their lives, for Port Clyde's reprieve, a worthy bargain. I became its favorite harbor, its voice when it wishes to speak without unsettling the fish. The Abyssal Whisperer, through Pierce, was not just a distant god demanding tribute. It was a parasitic intelligence, a consciousness seeking tendrils into our world. Pierce wasn't just its high priest, he was its compromised vessel, a sickening hybrid of man and monstrosity, maintaining a precarious balance that kept Port Clyde safe only by feeding the horror that lay just offshore. And now, the layered voice continued, Pierce's blue glowing eyes fixing on me with an unnerving intensity. It desires a new dialogue. Your science, Doctor. Your understanding of its domain. You can teach it so much more than these simple fisherfolk. How to truly bridge the gaps. How to perhaps walk among you, unseen. Abyssal Whisperer's ambition was terrifyingly clear. It didn't just want souls. It wanted knowledge. Access, and I, with my grief and my scientific background, was the perfect candidate to become its next, perhaps more complete, conduit. Old Finn, he had one last desperate gambit. As Pierce Whisperer advanced, the cave air crackling with an unseen energy. Finn lunged from a shadowed alcove where he'd been hiding, a crude harpoon, probably one of his own ancient sealing tools, clutched in his bird-like hands. He wasn't aiming for Pierce, but for a cluster of phosphorescent, pulsating fungi growing on the cave wall. Fungi dismissed as a natural phenomenon. The old song, "It sleeps in the glowing stone," Finn shrieked, ramming the harpoon deep into the luminous growth. The effect was instantaneous. The fungi exploded in a shower of cold, ethereal light, and a high-pitched, multifaceted keening filled the cave, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of hearing. Pierce Whisperer screamed, a horrific, layered sound of agony, clutching its head, its luminous eyes flickering wildly. The blue light receded, leaving only Pierce's panicked, human gray. The sibilant whisper in his voice vanished. The keening sound from the fungi seemed to resonate with something deep within the island. And outside, the ocean roared with a new, enraged fury. The tide, which had been ebbing, surged with unnatural speed, waves slamming against the cliff face, sending plumes Scylla spray high into the air. The cave mouth was suddenly awash, and then they began to arrive. Not just one or two, dozens. Propelled by the furious summoned tide, the dead washed into the cave entrance, bloated, silent, their empty eyes fixed on us. Among them, horrifyingly distinct, was the thing that wore Lena's clothes, Lena's locket, and beside it, a figure with features too similar to my lost colleague Sarah. They weren't just lures anymore. This was an assault. The Abyssal Whisperer, its connection to Pierce momentarily severed or weakened, was calling its full grotesque army. Ava raised her service weapon, her face a grim mask of determination. Finn, his moment of defiance spent, collapsed against the cave wall, spent. The battle for Blackwater Island, for our sanity, for perhaps more than we knew, had begun in earnest. The tide of horrors was upon us. The cave became a charnel house, a claustrophobic arena of roaring water and encroaching horrors. The keening from the shattered fungi was a disorienting shriek, but it also seemed to cause the waterlogged abominations around us to falter, their movements becoming jerky, uncoordinated. It was as if Finn's desperate act had disrupted not only Pierce's connection, but also the Whisperer's fine control over its gruesome puppets. Pierce himself, momentarily just a man again, stared in abject terror at the tide of bodies surging into the cave. "No, not like this," he stammered, his bravado, his unholy symbiosis, stripped away, leaving only a frightened old fisherman. But the respite was brief. A larger wave crashed through the entrance, and with it, a palpable surge of cold, alien intelligence. The blue light rekindled in Pierce's eyes, stronger, more malevolent than before. The sibilant whisper returned, no longer layered with Pierce's rasp, but dominating it, a voice of ancient depths and infinite hunger. "You cannot silence the ocean, mortals. You will all become part of the song." The thing wearing Lena's form, and the one resembling my lost colleague Sarah, were at the forefront, their movements now disturbingly fluid, purposeful. Sarah Thing lunged at Eva, decayed fingers outstretched. Eva fired her shots, punching into its sodden mass, causing it to recoil but not fall. It was like shooting at a wet sponge. My mind, spurred by adrenaline and a desperate dawning understanding, raced. The learning, the mimicry. The Whisperer wasn't just puppeteering. It was imprinting, creating crude, horrifying echoes of personality, of memory. If old Finn's glowing stone disrupted its control, what if a stronger, more personal resonance could sever it entirely from a specific mask? "Lena!" I screamed, not at the creature, but at the memory, at the pain, at the love that still burned like an open wound. I shouted out the intimate details of our life together, the name of her favorite hidden beach, the silly song I wrote for her, the foolish argument we had the morning she left for that final voyage. I poured every ounce of my grief, my regret, my undying affection into the words, projecting them like a shield or a weapon. The Lena thing faltered, its head tilted, its movements becoming less sure. The borrowed voice tried to respond. "Marcus, don't remember hurting." But it was fractured, overlaid with that sibilant oceanic whisper, as if two consciousnesses were warring for control of the grotesque vessel. Saying the momentary effect, Eva caught on. She yelled out details, specific commands, procedural jargon from her police training. Things only the real Sarah, a meticulous scientist, would have responded to with such precision. The Sarah thing also hesitated, its predatory advance wavering. It was a battle of wills, of memories, against an ancient alien intelligence that wore the faces of our dead. Harold Pierce, now fully a conduit for the enraged Whisperer, advanced on old Finn, who lay gasping against the cave wall. "The old bloodline ends," the layered voice hissed. the old songs will be silenced. Before Pierce could reach him, I acted. My uncle's journals that mentioned the island's unique geology, a network of submerged limestone caves, one of which supposedly extended deep beneath the lighthouse, kept partially open by a freshwater spring. They also mentioned the Tidekeepers' fear, Scylla the freshwater's kiss, believing it diluted the Whisperer's influence. A desperate gamble. I grabbed one of the heavy iron pry bars we'd found among the Tidekeepers' ritual tools. Eva, the lighthouse. There's a spring. If we can flood this section of the network, while Eva covered me, firing methodically at the encroaching horrors, keeping them at bay, I attacked the far wall of the cave, where Finn's carvings hinted at a thinner section of rock. The sounds of the battle were deafening. Eva's gunshots, the Whisperers enraged hissing through Pierce, the grotesque gurgling of the waterlogged bodies, my own ragged breaths, and the clang of iron against stone. Finally, with a sickening crack, the rock gave way. Not to open air, but to a rush of dark, surprisingly cold, and distinctly fresh water. It poured into the sea cave, mixing with the rank, salty brine, creating a turbulent, churning maelstrom. The effect on the Whisperer-controlled entities was immediate and dramatic. Pierce shrieked, a sound that was pure, undiluted agony, the blue light in his eyes extinguishing like a snuffed flame, leaving him to collapse, a sodden, broken old man. The waterlogged bodies convulsed, their forms seeming to desiccate, to shed their borrowed coherence, as if the fresh water was an acid, dissolving the psychic glue that held them together. They began to fall apart, literally, turning into so much rotting flotsam in the roiling water. The Lena thing and the Sarah thing gave one last sorrowful look towards us, their features momentarily clearing, just for an instant, showing a flicker of the gentle souls they once were, before they too succumbed, their forms dissolving into the dark, murky, diluted brine. The Abyssal Whisperer, its anchors severed, its influence diluted, seemed to recoil. The pressure in the cave lessened. The unnatural tide began to recede rapidly, as if the ocean itself was sighing in defeat, or perhaps in weary resignation. Ava and I, battered, soaked, and heartsick, stood amidst the wreckage, the freshwater spring now gushing freely, washing the last vestiges of the nightmare back out to a suddenly, eerily calm sea. Old Finn was gone, swept away by the initial surge, or perhaps finally claimed by the ocean he had both feared and revered. The aftermath was a silence more profound than any storm Blackwater Island felt. Scoured, the oppressive presence that had choked its shores was lifted, replaced by a clean, sharp tang of salt and the mournful cries of gulls, sounds that were now merely sounds, no longer omens. Harold Pierce was just a man, old and broken, when Eva Rostova finally cuffed him. He offered no resistance, his eyes vacant, the terrifying symbiosis seemingly shattered for good. He mumbled about breached pacts, about the sea's inevitable reclaiming Scylla promises, whether he would face human justice or if the island's deeper secrets would remain buried with him was a question for the mainland. We found old Finn's body washed up in a small, calm cove on the far side of the island, his face peaceful, the ancient carvings clutched in one hand. We buried him there, above the high tide mark, under the twisted pines, with the sound of the now indifferent ocean as his only eulogy. I couldn't stay. Blackwater Island was a tomb, filled with too many ghosts, too many echoes of what I'd lost, and what I'd almost become. The lighthouse, my uncle's strange legacy, I signed it over to the state, with a recommendation it be allowed to crumble back into the stone from which it was built. Some places are best left to the elements and to their memories. Eva Rostova, in her official report, was a Master Scylla understatement. A reclusive local cult led by a delusional fisherman. A tragic accident during a severe storm. No mention Scylla impossible biology. Scylla voices from the deep. Scylla rules that meant the difference between life and a fate far worse than death. The world she knew wasn't ready for Blackwater's truth. Perhaps it never would be. Months later, back in the sterile confines of a university lab I'd reluctantly returned to, I found myself staring into a deep-sea specimen tank. The creatures within, pale and alien, moved with a silent grace. The nightmares had lessened, but the sound of the ocean, even the memory of it, still carried a faint underlying hum, a resonance I would never fully shake. One evening, sorting through some of my uncle's few remaining personal effects that had been shipped to me, I found a small, intricately carved wooden box. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a single perfectly preserved conch shell. It was beautiful, its spirals intricate, its lip a delicate rose. I'd seen shells like it before during my expeditions in the deep Pacific trenches. Reluctantly, almost against my will, I lifted it to my ear. I expected the familiar, comforting roar of the ocean locked within its curves. Instead, I heard a whisper. Faint, almost inaudible, but undeniably there. And it wasn't the roar of the waves, nor the sigh of the wind. It was a voice, sibilant, ancient, and it knew my name. Marcus, it breathed. A sound not Scylla air and lungs, but Scylla immense pressure and abyssal cold. We learn. We adapt. The currents always return, and we remember. You're unique. Understanding. My blood ran cold. The connection wasn't truly severed. The Abyssal Whisperer hadn't been destroyed, merely inconvenienced. It was still out there, in the unseen depths, patient, learning. And it knew that my knowledge, the very science I had dedicated my life to, was not a shield, but a beacon, a lure for horrors that defied all understanding. The Requiem for Lena, for my team, for the lost soul, Scylla Blackwater, was not yet over. It was merely waiting for the next tide. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would always find its way back to shore. Blackwater Island holds its secrets tight, guarded by rules etched in salt water and fear. Marcus Thorne learned that some doors, once opened, are never truly closed. The rules were a desperate shield against a horror waiting in the depths. The Abyssal Whisperer may be wounded, but its song is eternal, and its hunger is vast. This is only the beginning of the watch. Seriously, if you didn't stay until the very end, you missed the ultimate revelation, the twist that reveals the true, terrifying scope of Blackwater's reach. The last few moments change everything. What do you think the Abyssal Whisperer is? What was the Tidekeepers' true covenant? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you made it off Blackwater Island, if the sea hasn't claimed you, then you're already a part of our story. Subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules, because some places, they never truly let you go. And the Whisper is always listening.